Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. And this is for our class for the 4th of November, where we are talking about The Exorcist and also getting ready to watch Halloween. I'm sorry that just with the way that the dates worked out, that we weren't watching Halloween last week when we actually had a Halloween coming up. But perhaps it's rather appropriate to have The Exorcist and Halloween serve as the bookends to our weekend for Halloween. The Exorcist has oftentimes made movie lists that indicate that it's the most frightening movie ever made, and you can make that determination for yourself whether you agree or disagree with that. Obviously, it's a film that's very much of its time, so as we saw with some of the hysteria with The Exorcist, much of that hysteria, I'm sure, had to do with the 1970s and with audiences not really being aware of the kind of gore that the film would show. Obviously, we've become much more lax with that as the years have progressed. And we discussed how something like Night of the Living Dead was gory, but The Exorcist brings it to a whole other level, something that Stephen King calls the gross out. But before we start talking about The Exorcist, or also start talking about Halloween, I wanted to talk about a few odds and ends. And as we get closer to the year 2000 and that particular decade, the movie that I had scheduled was 28 Days Later. And my class last semester decided that we would watch this film, even though it happens to be about a virus plague, and there are perhaps some uncomfortable parallels with our current time. And I just wanted to make sure that this class and this semester was feeling similarly. So if you feel that that movie is not appropriate or it's going to be just too uncomfortable to watch, please let me know. Send me an email. And based on your feedback, I can always make a change. My class last semester had indicated that they thought that it would be a very timely film, and that also would give us a certain level of hope because the film is much darker and more apocalyptic than anything we're experiencing now. But I will leave that to your discretion. Again, please, if you've got a concern about that particular film, we've got a couple of classes left before we get to the 2000s. Please let me know. I also wanted to let you know that this is registration time, so you should have heard from your advisor, and you can see in the notes below that I've indicated a link where you can see the classes for the spring semester, or yes, for the spring semester, as well as for the intersession. So, and certainly if you have any questions or concerns about registration, feel free to let me know. And I also wanted to remind you about the final project as well, as we're getting closer to the ending of the semester. Hard to believe that we're already in November, but experience has shown me that once we hit November, things move very, very quickly. So the hope is that you've already got an idea for the final project. Again, I encourage all of you to send me emails to give me an idea what you're thinking about doing your final project about so that I can give you some suggestions and some assistance. In terms of The Exorcist, I had scheduled a documentary for you to watch that talked a little bit about the hysteria, and there really is no other way to put it. It was hysteria when this movie came out, and for many reasons. It definitely violated many of the cultural and cinematic taboos of the time. And they also utilized a good number of subliminal techniques to disorient the audience, which I think I might have mentioned in the last video, where they were using audio and they were also using video. The musical score itself is nothing short of iconic, Tubular Bells, and I have to admit that this is also the ringtone for my phone, so I'm very fond of that score. And it was based on a New York Times best-selling novel, and that had been on the bestseller list for weeks and weeks. That was loosely based on documented exorcisms. One actually that had occurred in Washington, and another that had biblical origins to it. And the focus of the film is basically Regan MacNeil as a possessed child, and that's a violation of all kinds of taboos. It even earned an X rating in Boston when it initially appeared, not because of sexuality, though certainly the scene with her inserting a crucifix into herself is rather troubling, but ultimately more because of the other graphic episodes in the film itself. That said, I've always said that this film and this text has been misread, that it's not so much about Regan and it's really more about the exorcists themselves, which is where we get the opening, with which is oftentimes confusing sometimes to viewers if they haven't read the novel, where we're introduced to Father Merrin, and he's on an archaeological dig. He's a man of science, but also a man of religion, so he's able to meld the two, almost like a Van Helsing figure from Dracula. And basically, Father Merrin is on an archaeological dig in Iraq, and that happens to be the believed to be the seat of paradise, the beginning of basically humanity, and this was where the fall of man occurred, and that this is why this piece of land will never experience peace and will always be troubled. And it seems that they unearth this demon Pazuzu, who's supposed to be a demon of sickness and illness. And the way that it's used in this particular film, definitely we can see that with the possessed girl with Regan. And that serves as a kind of frame for later on, where we've got basically a Father Karras who will be assisting Father Merrin in the exorcism. And Father Merrin is sort of the father figure to a Father Karras. But both of them suffer from their own demons. And if we wanted to view this film as a psychological investigation of being haunted by demons, as we saw with the film, Father Karras is torn over the state of his mother, who dies basically alone and penniless because he's made a decision to go into the priesthood, which has very generously educated him at the best schools that exist. So if he were able to take that education and go into the private sector, he could be a very wealthy psychiatrist. But instead, he's taken a vow of poverty, and we could see how he lives in contrast to some of the higher echelons of the Catholic Church, and there definitely is a distinction between the two. Now, even someone like Father Merrin has his own demons. They're not necessarily explored that well in the film, but more so in the text, about arrogance and pride. And pride, remember, was the downfall of Lucifer in the first place. And the idea that rather than Father Merrin catering to the poor or catering to the weak, that instead he is writing books and going on archaeological digs. When we are introduced to Chris, notice the connection with Christ. Now, she's supposed to be an atheist, and she also has her inner demons. You think about what she does for a living. She's an actress, and basically actors lie for a living, which is what she's doing. She happens to be living near a church where she's living in Washington, D.C. It's one of the reasons why the demon is able to attack her, as well as the fact that she's an atheist, as well as the fact that she's divorced, and that would have been seen as a possible sin in the 1970s. There's even a Ouija board in the house that allows her daughter Regan to communicate with the spirits. Chris's inner demons are her guilt over the fact that she's chosen her career over her family. And again, the text talks more about that than the film does, but I think it's somewhat clear in the film as well, especially when we think about the setting of the film, which is Washington, D.C. And if we were ever going to find a locale for evil and a locale for lies, it's got to be Washington, D.C. So I think there's a little bit of humor there. Dennings, the drunk, also has his own demon, and that happens to be alcohol. And when we think about the turmoil that was occurring in the 1970s, this was the scene of campus protests. If you remember in the film, Chris is actually filming a film, so it's very meta in that respect, about campus protests, and that you need to work within the system, which is something that basically Father Merrin or Father Karras is going to have to deal with this himself when he's trying to get authorization for an exorcism. It was a time of drugs, and in fact, parents were so frustrated with their children, they oftentimes said that their kids were acting as if they were possessed and were unrecognizable. And I think we definitely see that in the fear of adolescence in someone like Reagan McNeil. The war and the counter protests about the war and the fact that there was the belief that the world was going to hell makes The Exorcist a rather timely movie, and perhaps one of the reasons why it resonated so much with its audience, though I view it more from the psychological perspective of the exorcists themselves, and being able to portray priests as human beings who were flawed, who would drink and would feel grief. This would have been very unusual for the time period. I don't know if you noticed all of the camera shots of doors, this symbolism of doors as an entryway into the psyche, as well as the idea of the entryway into the spiritual world, or perhaps into evil. There are multiple possibilities of explanations in The Exorcist, whether we wanted to use the psychological, and there also is the paranormal, and then lastly, there's the supernatural. So many audiences have said that some of the most horrific scenes of the movie are actually the medical scenes where they're trying to diagnose Reagan. And the way that the medical profession and the psychological profession is basically torturing this girl and is unable to help her and to diagnose her. If we wanted to view a kind of psychological or physiological explanation for her behavior. If we wanted to do a kind of paranormal explanation for her behavior, there is a phenomenon known as poltergeist. And in fact, you might even be familiar with the film by Steven Spielberg entitled Poltergeist. And this is an idea of a spirit that's more than mischievous, but certainly not demonic, and that oftentimes poltergeist activity isn't necessarily something that's done by an outside entity, but it's something that comes from within the individual who has paranormal abilities, things like telekinesis, for instance, and that poltergeist activity oftentimes centers around a young adolescent girl. And one of the reasons why is because this is a time of particular turmoil for human beings, adolescents, and for the female in particular, and the beginning of puberty and menstruation, and all of the repressed and suppressed feelings and confusions are manifested itself through this activity where objects can be moved and seemingly supernatural events can occur. Of course, there's always the supernatural explanation, which is part of the reason why the film probably led to so much hysteria for those individuals who had a firmly embedded belief in religion and the idea of a devil actually having the ability to possess an individual, and of all people, an innocent girl who happens to spend her time alone, by the way. And we know that in horror films, isolation is an element of danger in the Gothic. Basically, her mother and even her caretaker are adults, and she's left to her own devices in a new city where she doesn't really have any friends outside of the Ouija board and the Captain Howdy, who could perhaps be some sort of a personification of her father from a psychological perspective, but could also be a demon or some sort of a spirit that happens to be haunting this particular girl. And we usually think of it from the supernatural perspective when we are thinking about this particular film, especially the ending of the film, where we've got Damien Karras, who seems to be overtaken by the demon, and we actually see some of the visual transformation, and he decides to sacrifice himself by jumping out of a window, almost like a Christ-like figure sacrificing himself for the well-being of others. And then at the very ending, the resolution where Reagan is returned back to normalcy, and That said, there is another version to this particular movie. And as you know, I was having some difficulty finding an online link for this movie in its entirety because of copyright issues. So if it turns out that you couldn't access it on your own, I gave you an Amazon link, and that if you were having difficulty with accessing that particular Amazon link, to please contact me because I could give you a password that would allow you access into that. Luckily, we're not having those problems with Halloween, I'm happy to say, because I was able to find a free online link that you could utilize. But the version that I had us watch, or the version that I had us, or that I have on Amazon for you to watch if you choose that one, was the original version that came out in 1973. There is a longer version of the movie that was re-released in the 2000s entitled The Version You've Never Seen Before, which I think is actually a rather poor name for a film, because once you've seen it, then it's no longer the version you've never seen before. It's longer, and there are also some scenes that are included that I think help to eliminate some of the questions about the film itself. Particularly, there's a scene that I've included in our notes below about, very briefly, the scene isn't there in its entirety, but very briefly, it's a conversation between the two exorcists, Father Karras and Damien, Father Karras and Father Merrin, and basically they're talking about the purpose of possession, and that ultimately the purpose of possession is not to destroy the possessed, but to destroy those individuals around the possessed. And also, there's a long conversation about how faith is something that's evidenced in action, not necessarily belief, so that you can feel internal disgust, but as long as you act with love, then ultimately that is all that God requires of you. This is a long passage also in the novel itself. And in the clip that I've included, you can see that there's a brief discussion about how it was originally omitted by William Friedkin, who made the movie, because he thought it was obvious. And then he reinserted it in the version you've never seen before, because this was the author's intent, and this is what the author wanted the movie to say. There also was a scene that was deleted because it was considered to be too graphic, believe it or not. And with all of the graphic episodes that we've seen with The Exorcist, and in fact, Regan MacNeil's head, the one that twists all the way around, is in the Smithsonian Institute Museum as a cultural artifact. But the scene that was viewed to be too graphic for The Exorcist would not be the scene with, let's say, Regan MacNeil masturbating with a crucifix. Instead, it was something known as the spider walk scene. And I've included that also in our notes if you want to see it. It's a very brief scene. It's less than a minute long or so. It's right after Chris MacNeil is told that Bert Dennings has been killed, and she's horrified. And then at that particular point, Regan MacNeil, the possessed girl, comes down the stairs doing what's called the spider walk, where basically she's crawling backwards down the stairs, and out of her mouth flows some blood. So you can decide for yourself if you want to watch that or if you think that's too graphic. Basically, a contortionist was hired to do that scene. And I think I might have mentioned to you that the actor Linda Blair was up for an Academy Award for playing the possessed girl, until it was found out that she didn't do her own vocals, that those vocals were done by another actress. So that disqualified her. But the mere fact that there would even be consideration of nominating her for an Academy Award speaks to the kind of power of this film, because horror films usually are dismissed as genre films and not having much cinematic worthiness, and The Exorcist was an exception to that, as was Silence with the Lambs, by the way. But we won't be doing Silence of the Lambs in this particular class, because I really see that more as a crime and a murder film than I do a horror film. But there's been debate about that. Or even something like Jaws has oftentimes been called a horror film as well. But what I wanted to try to do was to identify films from each decade that in one way or another could speak to some of the fears and the anxieties of that decade. And I think the 1970s, a time when, again, the youth culture was uprising, and when many individuals were afraid of youths, as well well as a time period with a lot of social and political turmoil and upheaval. And you can't help but notice the wealth and the affluence of Chris McNeil as compared to, let's say, someone like a Damian Karras, or worse yet, his mother. And I think we're supposed to see that inequality as perhaps some of the evil that does exist in the world that doesn't necessarily have to be attributed to some sort of supernatural entity. But in moving forward, Halloween, even though it's from the same decade, so I cheated. I know I'm supposed to be finding a film from the 1980s because I've been using The Exorcist as our film from the 1970s. So my excuse is that the 1980s was a decade that was very much influenced by the slasher film. And we think of Halloween as really being the originator of the slasher film, even though it came out in 1978. So therefore, I'm going to cheat a little bit and use our film for the 1980s as Halloween, a film that came out in 1978. And the director is John Carpenter, who indicated that he was quite influenced by Psycho. So when you see this particular film, you might see some parallels there. And oftentimes, the slasher films are connected to the conservative movement of the Ronald Reagan administration of the 1980s, which is something that we're going to be talking about further when we talk about Halloween. But I thought that today's attendance question could be via our class discussion forum due on Thursday, November 4th by 6 p.m. But if you need a little bit more time, just let me know. Why do you think Halloween was such a successful movie? Why do you think Halloween was such a successful movie? Since I was able to find the link, I've given you 24 hours to watch this movie. But again, if you need extra time, there is no problem with that whatsoever. But you should be able to access the link that I've provided, so you're not going to need to go onto Amazon or find it for yourself. And as I've been indicating, now that we're getting to more contemporary films, I'm just evaluating film by film. We'll see how many I can find or not find. And certainly, if any of you have found a free link to The Exorcist somewhere, if you could send that to me, I would be very appreciative for my future classes. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I'm going to leave you with the very classic Halloween and the question of why do you think it was so successful when it really shouldn't have been a successful movie. This was just a little independent movie that somehow made this huge name for itself. So take care, and we'll talk next week, so to speak. Bye-bye.